bringing or resurfacing some of these older articles. But in this article, you take motivation from this previous audit of sociology research, where they looked at studies on racial stratification and how they often downplayed racism and the racial realities of minoritized communities. So then within education, you looked at how racism was handled in education research. And so the ways that in education, folks tend to focus on race and ethnicity and not racism and racists, right? And so I think this is really, really important right now because anti-racist work is so popular right now, right? So many people are wanting to integrate anti-racism in the work that they do, to study it, to center it in their practice. And so, but a part of what sustains racist systems is what folks are calling the new racism, right? And so it's this racism that involves like doing work about race that goes nowhere to dismantle racist structures and systems. So we have a lot of scholarship that's being used to inform education practice that can allude to racism or that evades racism even by like framing it as a personal experience or just understanding the experiences, how people experience racism, but not looking at institutional systems and structures as exclusive and violent, spaces. So given that anti-racist work, particularly coming out of the summer, it's on the uptick. I wanted to hear your thoughts on this, because I know there are a lot of scholars, new scholars that are poised, ready to jump into anti-racist work, and even some of older folks. One of the things I appreciate in this particular article is that you acknowledge that some of your early work, fell into the same as did mine. You know what I'm saying? Like I think about one of the more popular articles that I wrote way back in the day. It was it reeked of deficit thinking and what I'm saying, all this stuff, whatever. So we've all kind of fallen prey to doing what we've been taught, or this learning the structure of like you've got to talk about all the negativity and the problems or whatever just to prove the worthiness, or that this is worth doing, when no, you don't have to do that to do what's right. You know what I'm saying? So I just want to hear your thoughts on this idea of this new racism, the anti-racist racism.
Oh my God, I have so much to say. So eventually I'll work my way to the article. Let me start with the significance of the current movement for Black lives. It has, on the one hand, been beautifully intergenerational, multi-ethnic. It has been really like delightful and inspiring to see so many people across so many racial and ethnic groups, not just here in the US, but also globally, take to the streets to declare that Black Lives Matter. That has been really great. On the other hand, it has made me, incredibly skeptical. I'm not normally a skeptical person, but I am skeptical about just sort of the trendiness of jumping on the anti-racist train without knowing exactly what that means. On weekends, my husband and I, throughout the pandemic, we will drive to various neighborhoods here in LA, often ones that we've never been to, and we'll park the car and we'll walk for a couple miles and just talk with each other, which is lovely.
Yeah,
One of the
very
things that I
nice.
notice, on those walks, though, that annoys me actually, is the number of Black Lives Matter posters that I see in people's windows. There's this one neighborhood in particular that I know for sure is a predominantly white neighborhood, and there's like Black Lives Matter flags and posters in the windows and stuff. And I don't know, it just made me wonder, like every time I see those, I wonder, how many Black people do you employ? How many Black people on your team? What would the Black people that you work with say about you? Would they be surprised that you have a Black Lives Matter poster hanging in your window, given that you have neither hired nor promoted any Black people since you've been at the place where you work, and that, you don't treat Black people so well, they don't matter in the workplace. I mean, it's like those things that, I think we have to constantly grapple with as we think about the trendiness of the current, the current movement. Um, it also reminds me, Toby, of like the trendiness of equity.
Yeah.
It's everywhere. Like there's just like so much like mishandling and misappropriation of like equity. And one of the things that I find troubling, and here's where we're going to get to the article, is that most people who are claiming to do equity work, or most organizations and institutions that, claim that they're committed to equity, do so in a way that lacks precision, right? It's almost like diversity in the 90s and early 2000s, how it was imprecise. Racial equity is what I'm calling for. I care about gender equity. As a gay man, I certainly care about equity for queer persons, so on and so forth. But I think it is important for us to specify what we mean when we talk about, write about, and claim to research things pertaining to equity, which is what I was calling for in the article like a decade ago. I was calling for us to be much more precise. You see, Toby, in the article, I pointed out the ways in which, and we're going to come back, I know, later and talk about semantic substitutes.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I wrote about sort of the very vague ways that these authors were writing about the experiences of racially minoritized persons. It was like so palatable, right? When I, in my research, am interviewing Latinx persons and Black people and Indigenous persons and Pacific Islanders and so on, they talk to me in a very different tone about the hurt, the devastation, the disappointment, the aggravation that they feel about the racism that they're experiencing. They don't give us, a softer, more sort of palatable re-articulation of what their everyday realities are. Um, they don't. I'll just give you one example. Higher ed researchers love writing about a chilly climate.
Oh my gosh. I was just about, that's literally what I was just about to say. It is literally what I was just about to say. I didn't know whether or not, because I remember in the back, like in grad school, when I was in the 90s, late 90s, chilly climate was like huge. And coming from where I was coming from, so I was a PR person that went back in the higher ed, and coming from the South, and like I just wasn't studying all this stuff or whatever when I was in school, and so I just remember responding to it in a very Southern kind of personal way, right? And an almost stereotypical way, right? Because if you ask most people, a lot of Black people about their stereotypes of white people when it comes to climate, most people would think that white people are okay with chilly climates. You know
Mm,
what I'm saying? That they like so when the weather starts to turn
mm.
and people have on shorts and everything, whatever, and a Black person's like with a down coat still on, and and everything, that you see these kind of racial differences in how we respond to the weather. But for some people, a chilly climate is actually pretty nice, and so maybe when you're talking about the climate being chilly, that's why it never changes, because a chilly climate is pretty nice to you. That doesn't sound horrible.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. But like for me as a climate researcher, when I'm talking with people in their workplaces, either in higher ed or in corporate contexts, and certainly when I'm talking to students in higher ed, students of color, and faculty and staff of color, and I ask them, how would you describe the climate of this institution to me? Toby, I've been doing that research for 17 years. Never once have I had a person of color say to me, I would characterize it as chilly. No, they're like, no, it's racist, it's anti-Black, it's violent, it's disrespectful, it's hurtful. Those are the things that they say to me. I've never heard a person of color characterize it as chilly. So, we just have to get into the habit of naming things what they really
Mhm.
are. Yeah, we have to do that.
Yeah, yeah. And so you talk a little bit about I also want to look at it from an administrative lens, right? Because we have on this call not just folks who are researching, but also people who are administrative leaders or practitioners, particularly the students in my class, master's student affairs master students. So they're going to working as practitioners. So from a when you look at engaging anti-racist practices and interventions and programs and curriculum and transformation from a policy and practice perspective, um, I think sometimes like helping people to understand how the way that even those things are framed, not just research, but how those things are framed as things to help students or to deal with achievement gaps or really kind of in some ways framed at fixing students that these sometimes can become the very programs that sustain racism and segregation and et cetera that again it's another form of racism that's dressed up as anti-racism.
Yeah,
uh, so
yeah,
talk to us about
I
that.
can take it from here. I already know what the question is. I can
Yeah,
take.
yeah, yeah.
So there have been more than 28,000 professionals from a range of industries, including K-12 schools, colleges and universities, and corporate contexts. More than 28,000 professionals have been in my living room here virtually since the first week of June for professional learning experiences related to race and racial equity, and for facilitated conversations about race in their workplace or in their institutional setting. One thing that I knew before the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and that I certainly have come to just know, even more deeply over these past 3 months, is that most professionals, including K-12 educators and post-secondary educators and leaders, have not had any course of study on race and racism anywhere in their educational or professional upbringings.
Mm.
So many of these professionals have, said to me and other members of our team at the USC Race and Equity Center that this is my first time ever talking about the things that we're talking about here. What I'm attempting to argue, Toby, is that you can't claim credibly to be anti-racist if you can't engage in a serious, sustained set of conversations about race and racism, not just a one-time anti-racist workshop or one-time implicit bias workshop, but you got to develop what Howard Stevenson calls racial literacy,
Mhm.
the ability to read racial situations, the ability to, you know, talk fluently about race with yourself, with your colleagues, with your students, and people in your community and your family. Um, so many well-intended practitioners go and create things and that's supposedly for people of color, but they do so in a decidedly raceless way. When you do that, the very programs and policies that you're creating are only going to reproduce racial disparities, racial harm, racial suffering, racial inequities.
Mm.
Yeah, that's what happens when we attempt to do things in a raceless fashion, or when we attempt to back end racial equity, meaning that we'll build the thing and then we'll come back and try to like tuck in the
Insert.
racial equity stuff at the end. like at that point, like you've already like you've already exacerbated racial harm. Let me give one quick example.
Yes, please.
Um, Back in July, I testified to Congress about the reopening of colleges and universities. Since that time, well, in preparation for that congressional testimony, I read a couple dozen um, campus reopening plans that were public facing on college and university websites. Since that time, I've gone and read dozens more for K-12 school districts as well as for universities and colleges. In my analyses of those campus reopening plans, Toby, like so many of them say not a word about anything racial. It's all about like physical distancing in classrooms and in lunchrooms and in residence halls and dining halls and so on. Um, the university ones sometimes will include like a physical distancing plan for those of you who were stupidly playing football during the pandemic. You know, it just amazed me that so much attention was placed on how do we get people into the football stadium and physical distance them, 3 seats apart and 2 rows behind each other. It was like really, really sophisticated thinking. But what about the people on the actual field,
Yeah.
like who are engaged in the actual contact sport during
Like
a
literal
virus?
contact. But
Actual contact. They're literally passing an object from one player to another. They're overwhelmingly Black. Like it just it baffled me that there was so much attention being paid to how to keep the spectators and the boosters
mm,
and the attendees at those games safe. Those people are mostly white, but no attention at all to how to keep the mostly Black players who are on the field safe.
yeah.
And you can't come now. Like, I mean, y'all already started
Mhm.
playing. Now you can't come on the back end and be like, okay, like here's where we're going to back end the racial equity focus on like the next phase of our plan. I don't know. I just it's annoying to me.
Yeah, yeah. And what's really interesting, like the way that you're framing it, like raceless, is when people are, scrambling around trying to come up with new innovations and new ways of thinking. And I'm like, well, you know what? A new way of thinking would be to just center race. Like that would be
Right.
a very new thing. And imagine what that experience might be like for particularly Black students who have never had race centered in their entire educational experience. I think, and essentially that's what we were doing with this class. This was a diversity in higher ed course, and with everything going on, I was just like, no, we really need to stop and center race, and we need to just go back. We're going to go back to Reconstruction. We're going to go back and just learn most of the history that none of us were taught, but that you need to know in order to have a real relationship with race and racism. So I want to draw some of the student questions. Jasmine Carter asks, in your article, you state that overwhelmingly when addressing stressors for minoritized persons on college or university campuses, majority of recommendations pertain to helping these persons cope instead of addressing racist institutional practices that engender stress.
Mm.
So in your opinion, how do we move from helping minoritized students and faculty and staff cope to shifting that paradigm of racist campus culture? So essentially, what does a shift from the individual to the institution look like in practice?
Yeah, it requires us to um, really help all of our colleagues understand um, that the inequities that we see are not um, fully attributable or even largely attributable to, you know, the persons who are most harmed, right, by those inequities, but instead it's the longer standing cultures, policies, practices, and institutional behaviors that produce those inequities. Let me see if I can be clearer. Um, it still continues to surprise me, Toby and Jasmine. Thanks for the question. How little emphasis is placed on really remediating educators, remediating the racial illiteracy that I talked about earlier, um, focusing professional learning and professional development experiences for teachers and school leaders and higher ed professionals on racial problem solving. But instead, like, we're like, oh, let's just throw a couple more dollars into the budget of the Black Cultural Center. As Toby knows, I am a huge, huge appreciator of Black culture centers and other
Man.
ethnic culture centers. Like a
You know,
huge,
I'll take it. I'm always gonna rock for giving them some more money.
absolutely, absolutely, right. But that can't be that's not the only solution. Some of those cultural centers, um, and the people who lead them, right? No shade, not a critique. I understand they're doing the best that they can with the resources that they have at times.
Sometimes, yeah.
So, listen, but those kinds of spaces and programs for students of color oftentimes are focused on like helping those students learn how to become resilient or helping them like develop grit, helping them to not internalize stereotypes. I think that that's really good. That's important. Those are important investments that we're making into the resilience. But like those students still have to go into a classroom, and then to another one after that, and to another one after that, in which the mindsets of their faculty members are the same, right?
Yeah.
Deficit, stereotype ridden, hopeless, racist. So I think what I'm suggesting here is that we're putting way too much attention on fixing students and not enough attention on fixing faculty and staff members who do harmful things to students and have harmful stereotypes about students. Okay, listen, I have just one quick story. I'll make it real quick. So I was working with a college and they had developed this African-American male student initiative. And one of the things that the young men in the initiative were saying is that they felt like their instructors had low expectations of them and had various stereotypes about who they were and so on. So the well-intended leaders of this African-American male initiative, they were Black men themselves, by the way, administrators. Their approach was, okay, let's get the guys some polos to wear on Wednesdays. Let's get them some ties and have like a tie drive, a tie donation drive, and they'll wear their ties on Thursdays. That will help their faculty members to, perceive them differently. My perspective on that is that you could dress them up in a tuxedo. The same deeply held stereotypes that those instructors have about those African-American men in their classrooms are not going to change just because of how they're dressed. You gotta focus on getting to the heart of correcting, first exposing and then correcting the implicit biases and racist assumptions that those educators bring to those classrooms.
Yeah, because at the core, even just by virtue of them being college students, they're defying one of these stereotypes, right? So you would think that they don't need to do all of that. They don't need to wear a costume because listen, they're not on the block. They're not, you know what I'm saying? These are students. They're sitting behind a desk somewhere. So why would you still have these negative stereotypes about people who are college going? You're right. It's not going to change.
It's what worries me about the people who are suddenly on the anti-racism train. Like, did you like really do the corrective work before you put on your Black Lives Matter t-shirt? Um, I don't know. Like, it seems to me that I'm I'm 44, almost 45. I don't know that like a one-time workshop or even like, I don't know, like a couple months of reading Ibram Kendi's book and other books like it would undo 45 years of prior racial socialization.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know.
Yeah.
I worry.
Yeah. But one of I mean, what I'm getting from this conversation is that need for these really deep, intense learning experiences for all of us who teach, run, lead any type of educational organization or institution. And I say all of us because um, like I made the point last time with Lori. Many folks definitely that belong to ethnically diverse populations, we haven't learned either. Like we've been going to the same
Right.
schools, we need the education, and but much less of these interventions for them, and like under reframing it, reshifting it, and we need the interventions that we
Yeah.
need interventions for our learning.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that's been happening in my work with corporations is that Black employees have been saying to me, like, all the white people that I work with, like, they be coming to me to like solve like the racial problems and to lead the conversations on race. I don't have any more expertise than they have,
Mhm.
other than my own individual lived experience. But like
Mhm.
you said, Toby, they say I went to the same schools that y'all went to. I've worked in the same companies that you all have worked in. As I've like climbed the corporate ladder,
Mhm.
I don't. I'm no more equipped to
Yeah.
do this than anybody else.
Yeah. Yeah. So Sheila Foreman asked, so she was the one that was talking about going back to the semantics and the semantic substitutes. Like, do you believe that the real reason for using semantic substitutes is a matter of convenience? What do you think the real reason that folks use semantic substitutes? Um,
I think
and
it's
if
some.
you could go back one more time, like give us because you have so many examples of them in the article, but can you give like you named chili climate, but give some other examples of these words that folks use that are soft when they talk about race.
Professor, here's the honest
Oh, you
confession.
remember?
I didn't do my reading in preparation for our time in the faculty lounge today. Um,
Yes,
so like I
I got
literally
it here.
don't
I
remember.
got it here. Yeah, 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 yeah. But let me first start answering the question about what do you think the real reason behind
Sure.
the use of these, and then I'm
I,
gonna search for some of the examples.
yeah, no, I don't think it's convenience. I think it's socialization. I think that we have been socialized through the people who teach us, through the things that they've assigned us to read. And I make this argument in the paper. I at least remember that, that I make this
Yeah.
argument in the paper that one consequence of reading raceless scholarship that's supposedly about race is that the people who read that then go on to replicate those same behaviors when they talk about and when they write about and teach about race themselves. So no, I think that we've been socialized through these things that we have been assigned to read to mishandle race in this way.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So here's some of them. You say alienating, hostile, marginalizing, chilly, harmful, unfriendly, negative, unwelcoming, prejudicial, discriminatory, unsupportive. And then you even talk about the other language that's very, very popular when we write academically: might, possibly, could be, presumably, like, so language that doesn't want to take a firm stance and say, yeah, this is absolutely what this is.
Yeah. To protect the innocent, we at the USC Race and Equity Center, we don't make public the recordings from our qualitative um, campus racial climate studies, or when we do them qualitatively in corporations, we don't make them public. I really wish we could, to be honest, so
Mm-hmm.
that people could just hear for themselves, right? Uh, it could be now that people of color do, in fact, unpack our pain in very public ways and relive our trauma for the benefit of advancing and improving the institutions, but we choose not to hear what those students or what those colleagues are conveying to us. But we hear very, very clearly, very powerfully in our interviews with them. They People don't talk about their institutions being unfriendly. They really don't. Um, they talk about racial terrorism
Mm.
that one experiences from one's department chair or dean or from another colleague, right? Um, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So do you think we need to have more like research workshops created or intentional training or teaching about this in grad school? Because I'm just thinking about, like, I think I don't know how much we're dealing with how we train graduate students to boldly and bravely kind of speak in a powerful and truthful and honest way, as opposed to, like, we might be pushing them to study the issues, the difficult issues, but are we teaching them how to write?
No, or how to talk
How to,
about.
yeah, 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 how
Right.
to communicate this.
No, no, we're not. But as you and I know, Toby, that you can't teach something that you hadn't learned yourself,
Mm,
right? Like,
mhm,
it first requires self work. Now, it could be that that self work is occurring alongside, um, the learning that our students are expected to do as well. Might I be bold and suggest that we can learn together alongside each other. That
mhm,
requires some humility.
mhm,
It requires setting aside the presumption that the instructor or that the administrator in charge is all knowing,
mhm.
right? It'd be great if we could all declare that that we're not where we ought to be on understanding how to talk about these issues and deal with them.
Yeah.
So there's that. For me, Toby, this is a matter of educational responsibility. Um, I'm thinking about, like, I always think about cycles. I'm a person who thinks in cycles. If one goes through 12 years of a K-12 schooling experience without ever really learning a lot about race, America's racial history, so on and so forth, then they go to college. And unless they slip and fall into a sociology of race course or an ethnic studies course,
FM. Mhm.
they could, graduate, after 4 or 5 or 6 years, literally never having read anything or engaged in any conversation about race. Well, then they go into the workforce in all of the industries. Some of them will become teachers there in South Carolina. Others will engage in, entry level policy making roles and will eventually grow up to be legislators there in South Carolina, governors, right? Y'all have produced at least one governor at the USC. I know you have. Um, we should fact check that, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say at
Oh,
least one
no.
governor has been produced by you, right? Some of them will lead businesses and manage businesses there in South Carolina. In all of those roles and industries, when people do racist things or they do things that sustain or exacerbate inequity, racial inequity, the university is partly responsible for that because we were negligent in preparing them for leadership in a racially and ethnically diverse society in their lives after college. So when they go on to make policy that disadvantages thousands or perhaps even millions of people of color unknowingly because of their unconscious biases or whatever, yeah, the university is partly responsible for that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it speaks to, I mean, essentially the current AERA call that you put forth for the theme this year is about taking responsibility.
Toby, could you help the people, tell them what it's all about? I'm gonna go to the bathroom.
Oh,
I'll be right back.
okay. Yeah. So the this year's call for AERA is on taking educational responsibility, and so essentially what he was saying, just now about the fact that educational institutions, like, would no longer can we just simply denounce what we're hearing in the news, or what decisions people politicians make, or wrongful things that we think business leaders are doing, and we critique and comment on them, but we don't take responsibility for the fact that we educated them. That in many of these spaces, particularly many of these positions, they not only have bachelor's degrees, they have graduate degrees. So twice they went to someone's college or university, and were never trained or had any type of critical learning that get them to engage these issues, or to think differently, or to think more broadly, or more critically. So in this current year's conference, we're asking for folks to center that about in research, presenting research that talks about educational accountability and responsibility, and really what it means to be a citizen scholar. Oh, see how I got that right back to, and now you're here. Hi.
Sorry, I've been
No, no problem.
almost.
That's like my fear. That's my fear going into these. So
Yeah, I've had two coffees, 2.5 of these, and 1.5 glasses of water.
okay, yeah. So no more drinking.
Okay.
Let's get through this. So last question from our students. Ailey McLennan asked, do you think that with the events that have taken place so far in 2020, which resulted in opening up more discussions about race and racism, and for more folks are actually talking about institutional racism, that there won't be as much hesitation in the future for scholars to directly address race? I like this one because and I'm wrapping up the student questions with this one. It's basically asking, are things changing? Like in the 8 years since you wrote this article, I think it was 2012 or something like that. Do you see more folks being more direct and explicit? Do you see it changing at all?
I see. Yes, is the good news, right? Um, I think that because of scholars like Toby Jenkins and Lori Patton Davis and um, Sam Macias and Julie Park and Kimberly Griffin, I think that we have inspired new generations of scholars to be more bold and more courageous and committed to truth telling and to naming in their scholarship. Um, I think that we have given people permission,
Mhm.
to write in particular ways is one of the things that I hear most about this one particular article. Um, like many people, and not just scholars of color, but also white scholars, have said to me that, this article gave me license to write in a new way.
Mhm.
Sometimes people will send me their papers that they've published, and they'll say to me, very sweetly, right, that I would not have written this way had it not been for your 2012 article. So thank
Mhm.
you. So yes, I do think that, with the work of the scholars that I named, and others whom I didn't have a chance to name, I do think that is changing.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm going to take one question from the chat. Um, so one of our prolific scholars at University of South Carolina, Dr. Gloria Butte, she asks, can you discuss different Black racial identities and the role that persons of color who are assimilationists, who have internalized racism, play in contributing to racism in the academy?
Um, hmm. To be honest with you, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about those Black colleagues of ours. Um, I just don't spend a lot of my time thinking about them in my work. Here's what I will say. We're watching, so this semester I'm teaching a course on race and racism in education.
Mhm.
And we're spending the first couple weeks watching Free Meek, the Amazon Prime docuseries, 5 episodes. And I won't spoil it entirely for people who haven't seen it. What I will just say though is that it is such a powerful illustration of systemic racism, given the incarceration of Meek Mill and the subsequent probation. And it really helps us understand what systemic racism looks like, right?
Mm.
But there are Black
I might
people.
add that
You
my
should.
class. I might add
It is.
to the
It
list.
stimulates such amazing discussion in
Mhm.
my class. My students are loving it. So the point here, right, without spoiling it, is that there are some Black people who are involved in the judicial system
Mhm.
who have some incredibly not only harmful attitudes, but they take incredibly harmful actions that very much sustain and advance white supremacy.
Mhm.
And my students have come to understand that people of color can in fact be complicit in a white supremacist project. um, so I think that that's the extent to which I go in my own work, just helping folks understand that we too can be complicit. But I just otherwise don't spend a lot of time thinking about internalized racism and how it plays out.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's difficult because for many years ago, we were talking about university cultural centers earlier, and just across the board, across the country, there's just such a huge difference in how they're run and the quality of them and everything. And but I remember thinking when I was really deep into that work, like working in them, how the the mismanagement of them,
Mm.
and the putting folks in leadership positions to run such an important space who do nothing, who don't, who are kind of along this lines of what you're saying. It's a powerful form of institutional racism, where you can argue that and say, oh well, we have this resource, but when it's okay for that resource to be dysfunctional, to not produce, to not create any substantive change, that's a form of institutional racism, because other spaces across campus aren't allowed to fail. Student
They,
activities.
they aren't allowed to fail, but Toby, here's where I've decided to like shift my energy. an emphasis. Yes, there are some badly led culture centers, but there are like way too many other badly led academic departments
Mm-hmm.
that are led by department chairs who literally have no clue, no administrator preparation. It's just sort of like a tag, it's your turn to be department chair. And like academic departments are just like such sites of just like terrible leadership in many places. So I decided that every student has to go to class if they are going to, persist at the institution through graduation. They got to go to class. So I don't know, like it might, for me at least, I've determined that the highest impact for me is to just like focus on, like upskilling department chairs, dismantling racism that occurs within, classrooms and academic programs, because that's where everybody has to go.
Yeah. And I think across the, regardless of where you situate the critique, it all still leads not necessarily to the individual who isn't prepared to run it, you know what I'm saying, but leads to the institutional structure that allows for that. You know what I'm saying? It's the institution that's allowing for these things to be run in this way without, the preparation and everything that folks need.
Yeah, let me just say real fast that a vice president for student affairs attempted to say to me with a straight face that the Black Culture Center on her campus was not doing enough to serve Black students. And my response was, your student activities office isn't either.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about her political science department, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and guess
say that one too.
Right.
All right. So I want to end it with these quick fire questions. Just sharing with everyone again. So the inspiration for this series comes from Inside the Actor Studio, and the academic dean who ran that particular television show or course, his name was James Lipton, and he would ask his guests a series of the same questions at the end of each episode. And he got these questions from Bernard Pivot, who was a French scholar. So I want to name them in recognizing and honoring that I'm getting these from them. But we're going to end with these quick fires from Inside the Actor Studio. What is your favorite word?
Thanks.
What is your least favorite word?
Whatnot. I hate when people say whatnot.
That's hilarious. What excites you professionally?
Transformation.
What turns you off professionally?
Lies.
What are your two favorite books dealing with race and life, fiction or nonfiction?
The first is Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. And a more contemporary one is Nobody by my dear friend, Mark Lamont Hill.
Yes. What is your favorite protest song?
Oh, this is good. We Shall Overcome, sung by Mahalia Jackson. So one of the things that I appreciate, Toby, that you did as we were preparing for this, that you played that really powerful song. A lot of times if I'm giving speeches, especially a Martin Luther King Day address or a Black History Month address, I'll play the Mahalia Jackson version of We Shall Overcome on repeat, just to get myself in the right, just sort of spiritual space. Yeah. I love
it. We were just talking about this. I'm writing this book on hip hop and mindfulness.
Of course you are.
And we were talking about like your hype song, your like what's the song that brings you to stage, or just the song that gets you into the space, like mentally prepared. Mine right now is Already by Beyonce. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't need to be nervous about any type of intellectual performative space that I go into, because I'm already, we already scholars. We've already been, all these things. Okay.
Right.
So what profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
DJing, which I do as a hobby.
Yes. Yes.
Um, in as much as I love being a teacher and author, I love to make people think. But nothing brings me more joy than to make people dance
Hmm.
through DJing, which I only get to do occasionally as a hobby. But yeah, if this academic thing doesn't work out for me, um, yeah, I'm gonna go get my life in DJing.
Yes. Well, I've booked you before. What profession would you suck at?
Anything that requires any sort of physical prowess. I'm a thinker.
Okay. If heaven exists, or whatever afterworld one might believe in, if you believe in afterworld, what would you like to hear God, Allah, Ra, whoever that spirit might be, say when you arrive?
I would like for God to say to me, "Well done, my good and faithful servant."
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr.
Thank
Harper,
you.
for joining us in the faculty lounge. So, everyone, this episode will be available tomorrow on the Museum of Education's YouTube channel and as a podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So, just search for the faculty lounge at U of SC and make sure that at U of SC is on there. That's important. It will also remain on the South Carolina ETV Facebook page. Thanks to South Carolina ETV Education for partnering to bring this course session to public audiences. And thanks to all of our partners in the College of Ed, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the Center for the Education and Equity of African American Students, the Office of the Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs, Center for Innovation in Higher Ed, and my home department, Educational Leadership and Policy Studies, for their support. Thanks to everyone for attending, and we will see you on October 6th for the next Faculty Lounge with another prolific national scholar and our provost at U of SC, Dr. William Tate. So peace, everyone. Thank you again, Dr. Harper, and
Thank
take care
you.
and be well.
Okay, you too. Love you so much.
Love you too. Bye.